Patreon lesson number 8, Lost in the Heavens. Hello everyone, and thanks for joining us for this next lesson in our Spiritual Awakening series called Lost in the Heavens. In the previous lesson, we revealed how we come to find ourselves on this planet, having descended from our source, and we used the parable of the prodigal son as a symbol for all that. Now in this lesson, we will explain what happens over the course of all our incarnations on earth, as we slowly awaken to the truth of who we are, and what we are not. And most importantly, we will describe those forces and conditions which we must face on earth, such as our own ignorance and illusion that distracts us, delays us, blocks us, and leads us astray on our journey. As we said, the prodigal sons and daughters have come to incarnate on earth. Now what happens? Well, human beings are like little children who've gone out from their home to play. And they become so enchanted in the world around them, not only have they lost their way back home, they've also forgotten who they are. Why? Mostly because of their own inner adversary, the egoism. Our egoism, leads us astray. And because of the 5 murderers, as they are called in the Hindu system. These 5 killers are our own 5 senses. We are using them to look outside us all the time. Of course, to live in this world, it's necessary to do that, but not exclusively. Not all the time. We are always looking to the external world for value, validation, and satisfactions of our needs at the expense of our inner development, at the expense of our own self-realization. By only seeking what is outside of ourselves, we have created a time and place outer self that is composed of the quality of our thoughts, emotions, intentions, and motivations. And the life of that outer self, for most, is primarily about what they can get and what they can do. By only attending to that little outer self, we've lost the connection with the real self, the inner self. And this has produced a harvest of dissatisfactions, troubles, and anxieties, resulting in the most insecure population on earth ever. All the good development of higher and higher standards of living have produced the most physical comfort and ease on earth ever. So why has that not resulted in the most secure and contented population on earth ever? All our material senses are outwardly focused and only receive impressions from the outer world. But it's the sense of sight that distracts us the most. Again, it's not wrong to investigate the outer world using our 5 senses and enjoy life. What is wrong is that we have not balanced our outer gaze with our inner sight. And by inner sight, we mean looking within. Looking within us for the lasting satisfaction that only finding our real self can give. The perennial advice on this can be summed up in one short sentence: know thyself. This is the most important imperative ever given to spiritual seekers. It was inscribed on the Greek temple of Delphi, taught in the Greek mystery schools, insisted on by Socrates, and advocated by Plato in many of his dialogues. But what self are we to know? The constant, changing little personality self, or the ever-steady inner self? Well, it's both, because we're dual in one. We will never know what we are as an inner self without first knowing who we are as the outer personality self. Now, at this point in our spiritual development, it's not all that clear to us who we are as a personality and what we are as an inner self. And this is going to require sincere introspection, or looking within to know both. In recognizing the irrational expressions of the egotism from the most reasonable expressions of the inner self, we will be able to separate our sense of self from the constantly changing, never satisfied outer self and transfer it to that of the perfect and never-changing inner self, the full transfer of which is called self-realization. but we have an enemy. We have a strong enemy in this process that does everything in its power to keep this from happening. Our adversary does not want us to see its weaknesses and mistakes. Now, this adversary is the negative pole of egotism. The positive pole of egotism is an ally in this process. And by positive pole of the egoism, we do not mean that part of the egoism that is totally flattered by itself or thinks it's better than others. It's not that part which blames others and exonerates its own actions. The positive pole of the egoism is that part that keeps the connection with the real self and exerts a pull on us toward that inner self. It is that part which has led you into your spiritual studies. It is that part which advocates kindness over callousness, love over hatred. When we follow the promptings of the negative pole of the egotism, we get lost and disconnected from the inner self, and often feel miserable in life. We must be keenly observant to which pole of our egotism we're listening to, because the one we listen to is the one we're going to believe is true. Now, we've talked before about the parable of the 10 virgins, which goes like this. When the day comes, the kingdom of the heaven will be like this. There were 10 girls who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 of them were prudent. When the foolish ones took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the others took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was late in coming, they all dozed off to sleep. But at midnight a cry was heard, "Here is the bridegroom! Come out to meet him!" With all that, the girls got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the prudent, "Our lamps are going out. Give us some of your oil." "No," they said, "there will never be enough for all of us." "You had better go to the shop and buy some for yourself." While they were away, the bridegroom arrived. Those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. And then the other 5 came back and said, Sir, open the door for us." But he answered, "I declare I do not know you." Keep awake then, for you will never know the day or the hour. Now, each of these groups of virgins represent the personality which can either express itself wisely or foolishly. The 5 lamps each group carries symbolizes the 5 senses. One group uses their 5 senses wisely. The other group uses their 5 senses foolishly. That's the meaning. The oil that using in their lamps represents the mind as reason. It's the wise group that uses their 5 senses rightly and reasonably, which gives light. The wise virgins think ahead to bring extra oil that they will need later. The foolish virgins do not, and so they run out of oil and thus have no light when needed. The foolish group are those personalities who do not use their 5 senses reasonably and are burning up the oil all the time. We have to use these divine gifts of senses wisely. Foolish people don't use their 5 senses properly. They have eyes to see, but do not see. They have ears to hear, but do not hear. They use their eyes to look, but they do not perceive deeply into what they're looking at. They listen with their ears, but do not deeply perceive the meaning of what they hear, which means they don't pay much attention to what's going on, to what the ears hear, what the eyes see. As it had been written about the foolish, they will be ever hearing, but never understanding. They will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Now, I think it's the Greeks who say something like, "We don't hear with our ears or see with our eyes, but with our mind." They say that because it is we ourselves who are interpreting everything we hear and see according to what's already stored in our subconsciousness. The point is, when a group of people hear the same words or see the same thing, they each will have their own understanding of what they see and hear. This is because it's us. It's we ourselves who ascribe the meaning to what we see and hear. Just think about Donald Trump. Now, in only hearing that name, not one of us has had the same understanding of that person. We each have our own view on that person, which is based on what we've already heard or seen or thought about him, which means each have created their own elemental, empowered with a meaning of him, imbued with a meaning of him, and we each react to that name accordingly. As you know, Christ used parables, symbolic stories, to express his teachings. And at the end of one, he often said, "He who has ears to..." And at the end of one, he often said, "He who has eyes to see, let him see. And he who has ears to hear, let him hear." With this advice, Christ is asking his listeners to go beyond what they've already thought or felt and enter deeper meaning of what he was trying to communicate. Now, he said this line over 40 times in what's left of his teachings in the Bible. And of course, many who heard his parables had no idea of what it was really trying to say, because they were not ready to hear it. That's the way it is with all deep spiritual teachings. At that time, some just took his stories literally, but others did catch his meaning. And yet even some of his disciples could not understand why he spoke in parables so much. So one day they asked him, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" He replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of the heavens has been given to you, but not to them." Why? Because those listeners had not prepared to receive it. They were not ready. They had no foundation to receive it at all. Now, this is such an important thing to know in studying any spiritual teachings. We must penetrate deep into the meaning of what we hear and see. And when we study teachings, we should never read them like we're reading a printed novel. We should never hear them like we're listening for entertainment to an audiobook. We should hear and read them carefully, trying to catch the meaning. After listening to or reading spiritual teachings, we then should immediately ask ourselves, what did we just read? What did it mean? And then at other times, we should go back and listen or read the words again to check our understanding of them. A fish trap exists for the fish. Once you catch a fish, you can forget about the trap and concentrate on the fish. Likewise, words exist for their meaning. Once you catch the meaning, you should concentrate on it, and you can forget all about the words. Back to the parable of the 10 virgins. Those that use their lamps with reason symbolize those personalities who through reason create right thought and right emotions, which truly gives us the light of understanding. The parable says all of them are waiting for the coming of the bridegroom. Well, what's that? The coming of the bridegroom is the awakening of our own spirit soul self as God. The marriage is self-realization. When will the bridegroom come? Nobody knows exactly when, but sooner or later that hour will definitely come. Yet how long will it be for the person who uses their 5 senses foolishly to reach the point of realizing the coming of the soul self in self-realization? Who can say? But for sure they must wisely use their oil with reason in their thought, reason in their emotions, and reason in dealing with material things. Using our 5 senses wisely gives us spiritual light. Now, another set of 5 can be seen in the 5-pointed star. The 5-pointed star is used for a safe out-of-body travel as a vehicle and as a symbol for the human being. A human being has 5 fingers, 5 toes, 5 material senses, and 5 super senses. And if you stand with your feet apart and your arms stretched to each side, your legs, feet, arms, hands, along with the head, forms a 5-pointed star. When we visualize a luminous white 5-pointed star completely around our whole body, we have created a powerful protective talisman. Also, a 5-pointed star represents the 5 virtues we are striving to develop in our personality. These in Christianity are called the 5 virtues of Christ. They are goodness, justice, wisdom, truth, and love. Of course, the greatest of these is love. As a symbol, goodness is associated with our feet. It's a foundation we stand on. I don't know if you've ever had anybody get really negative and aggressively attack you, not physically, but emotionally. The best thing you can do, of course, is not to react and fight back, but also you need to stand firm on goodness, not to be harmed. If you're coming from and stay in a place of goodness, you're on firm ground and the attack will not harm you. It will not knock you over. Stand on goodness and you will be protected. Now, the hands in this symbol represent justice, the virtue of justice. And justice is a measure. To be fair with ourselves and others, we must learn to measure things rightly. So we ask ourselves, is what I'm doing fair? When exchanging with others, we must measure to see if it's a fair deal or are we being taken advantage of. And likewise, we must make an honest assessment if we're taking advantage of the other person. So that's why justice is seen as a measure. It's seen symbolically associated with the hand. The next virtue is wisdom, and that is associated with the ears. With wisdom, we should listen very carefully, because we must have those ears to hear, to understand really what's going on. We should not just dismiss what others are saying to us because it disagrees with what we think of ourselves. We must take what they say into consideration to correctly understand the situation. We can't just blindly reject their reality and substitute our own. If we've created in us a feeling of being offended or wounded by anyone, we have created a pain-inducing elemental. There are no pain elementals in and of themselves, but there are many elementals that induce pain in us. This means, for example, we may be inspired to do something or say something that in the end results in pain. As Daskalos emphasized over and over, and I quote him now, "The elementals created by the feeling of being wounded or offended are the worst devils in you. I say and insist now that we should get rid of this devil called the feeling of being wounded or offended." And the only way to be free of pain-inducing elementals is with objective reason and firm decision. Reason to yourself with these questions. Why should I let someone's words or actions upset me? To what degree is that person right or wrong? Well, of course, everyone tends to think they're right and the others are wrong, but we got to go beyond that self-centered view and try to look at both sides objectively. And then decide not to be upset or affected. Just think what they're saying over honestly. Now, it's not an easy thing to do, I know, but we must learn how to be free of our own pain-inducing elementals and not to have discord with others. Wisdom is associated with the ears, and truth with the eyes. Now, as Daskalos advised, if someone comes to you and they are yelling and screaming and complaining, he said, ask them why they're doing that, but not with words. Just look them in the eyes, directly in the eyes, and say the words silently. And he said, they will usually just tell you right away what the reason why. So speak truth with your eyes, not only your words. Even when we calmly speak truth with words to someone who's already upset emotionally, they will become angrier and more aggressive. Haven't you noticed that before? Another view Daskalos pointed out for us to consider is that sometimes a so-called enemy can be our best friend, telling us something we should do to change for the better. So those who are enemies in reality sometimes are helping us see something in us we did not observe before. Just listen to what that fellow says. Listen to see, but do not be affected by the attack. The other virtue, of course, is love, and the language of love is represented by the mouth. When speaking, we must always endeavor to speak softly with love. People are not in need of harsh words. This is especially true those who we have conflict with. And they may even consider us their enemy. These people need our love more than our friends do. So when you speak to them in words, say it with love. Leo Tolstoy was a remarkable fellow, and he observed there were different kinds of people in the world. He said there was the common people, great in number, that didn't have a clue what was going on in this world. Then there were some people that realized we are in a world of illusions, not worth living in, and so they suicided. Other kinds of people just followed the path of eat, drink, and be merry and did not concern themselves about it. Then he said there are the others who woke up to this world of illusion and transformed. They came to the higher knowledge to deal with this world, and yet all the while realizing they were living in a world of illusion. This is a similar attitude to the Buddhists, which say that we all must joyously participate in the sorrows of life. We are in a world of illusion, great suffering, a world of seeming separation. We all feel separated from each other and from God, and mostly from our real self. But it's not really possible to be separated from our source any more than it's possible for a cherry blossom to bloom and live if it was separated from the branch of the cherry tree. And this material world of illusions, as well as the other higher psychonoetical worlds, are surrounded and interpenetrated by the eternal realm of beingness, which is the source of all the worlds of existence and which gives life to these worlds. The non-dual state of beingness gives life to these worlds and everything living in these worlds. Christ taught it this way. He said, I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. But don't think Christ was saying that as a personality about himself. Christ is a pan-universal principle. So it's the Christ principle saying that. In other words, if we don't have a conscious connection with our real self in God, let's say it like that, we will not produce much lasting results, especially in raising our consciousness or uplifting our awareness. Yet even in our seeming separation from God and self, we're creating negative desires, emotions, and thoughts that create a dirty personality self-consciousness. But if we were really disconnected from the absolute infinite selfhood that we call God, it would not even be possible to have that negative, dirty little self-consciousness. If we were cut off from our source, our little consciousness as a personality would immediately stop. Just like if you cut off a branch of a plum tree, the bud on that branch will not be able to produce a plum. So we were, we are, and always will be connected to God, even if we do not perceive that connection. Again, the five senses are the five murders that lead us outward and entangle us in outer conditions where we can become lost. The other thing that really gets us to go astray, and everybody has this problem, is our overvaluing and undervaluing of people, places, and things. This is one of the biggest errors that causes problems in our life. For example, maybe we get in a marriage or a relationship or a business deal and we overvalue that other person's nature. Then when the truth comes out as to their real nature, our illusions about them get broken. We become disappointed in that person, and that causes us pain. It's not so much because of their real nature, but because we ourselves have overvalued them, and that gives us pain when we realize it. Or maybe you overvalue yourself. This is just another side of the same coin of overvaluing. What is needed is to learn to be objective, but we cannot really do that from the point of our own egoism. The egoism is never objective. So we must try to reach a higher viewpoint of the inner self, to be truly objective and know the proper value to place on the people, places, and things in our life. Of course, everyone's going through life with their own personality's standard of measure. Yes, we have a measure, but maybe we look at ourselves and see a weakness and say, oh, it's just a tiny weakness. It's nothing but a trifle. But then when you look at the weaknesses in others, particularly those you don't agree with, they appear to you as great crimes. This means the measuring standard of our personality is like a rubber ruler that expands and contracts depending on who we are measuring and how much we dislike what we see. But we need to replace that stretchable rubber ruler with an unstretchable steel ruler and hold ourselves to the same measure that we're holding other people. This should be the measure of justice. The number one cause of our problems in life and a loss of connection with our inner self is how we as a personality self use the mind. How are we using the mind? What kind of thoughts are we creating? What kind of emotions are we creating with it? Whatever they are determining our self-consciousness as a personality. As a researcher of truth, we know that every emotion, every thought, every behavior, every intention, and every motivation creates an elemental. So what's an elemental? An elemental in some spiritual schools is just called a thought form. But there are two classes of thought forms. The first class is the emotional thought form. This is the most common class. About 80% of all the elementals out there are this kind. Emotional thought forms mean their form is constructed with way more emotion or desire in them than they have thought. Now, one of the problems with that is the mind should be the master of emotions. There's nothing wrong with having good emotions and clean desires, but the emotions shouldn't rule our mind. But when we start having a strong desires, what do? Say we want a car, we want a house, we want this thing or that thing. The first thing that happens is that the emotional desire enslaves our mind to figure out how to fulfill the object of our desire. Then instead of being a master of our desires and emotions, we end up being a slave of our emotions and desires. And a slave does not really enjoy their life. Today, virtually all of humanity have become debt slaves to their desires for material things to some degree. Another problem with this process is that once you fulfill a desire, very quickly we lose interest in that object of desire and new desires take its place and present themselves to us to be fulfilled. Desiring is endless, and desires behave just like viruses because they are viruses. Desires are emotional viruses. They go on and on unless we ourselves stop them. And unless we disenergize them, they will be fulfilled in this life or the next. That is why it's always said to be careful what you wish for, because eventually it's going to come to you and be fulfilled. And a strong desire today could come to fruition in the future when it presents itself as an obstacle. Here we're talking about the unnecessary desires and uncontrolled desires. Nothing wrong with good, noble, or necessary desires. We all have a great gift from God that the animals do not have, and that is we get to use the mind as we choose directly. The trouble is we do not have a manual on how we should be doing that in a constructive way. So we are often misusing the mind in a destructive way. And we need to talk about the way to use the mind constructively, but we need to talk first about what really happens when we use the mind. And what really happens is that the way we use the mind always creates elementals, night and day, even when we're dreaming. So for it to exist, every elemental must get a form, a shape, a color, which has a power and a purpose for its existence. Some elementals are angelic and benevolent. Others are like malevolent demons. Fortunately, only real clairvoyants can see them. Most people can feel them, but everyone is under their influence. And it's God's mercy we don't see them, because the destructive emotional thought forms have a terrifying form. They will scare you. They take the form according to their nature. The forms can be big snakes like anacondas, wild bears, and other wild animals. Some see them in their dreams. When children see them in their dreams, they scream intensely. And today, doctors label them with night terror without knowing the real cause. And for that matter, what else could be the cause of adult nightmares but seeing the form of harmful elementals. All elementals are living existences. Whether good or bad, they will automatically be disenergized once they have fulfilled the purpose of the desire which gave them life, or unless we consciously disenergize it. But if left unchecked, they can, and often do, come to dominate over the personality who created them. They demand for their life to be prolonged by getting us to repeat them over and over. In other words, they get re-energized and renewed by the attention we give to them. The process makes the elemental so strong that it becomes a torture to the one who created it. Now, if the elemental is not fulfilled or de-energized, it will accompany its creator further in this life, and even beyond death of their material body. So a good or bad elemental can return in another incarnation, either to serve us or to harm us. This means that it's not only our deeds which hold us responsible, but our thoughts and desires as well. In other words, our elementals. Once created, an elemental has a form that can never be killed. But we can kill the power in them that we ourselves gave them, and this renders them inactive. We are creating thousands and thousands of them every day subconsciously. We create them and they become the habits in our lives. If we keep repeating a habit too many times, it becomes an addiction. Empower them even more and they become OCDs, obsessive compulsive disorders. Habits, addictions, and OCDs are all driven by the same mechanism, the elementals. All elementals also have an intelligence. In fact, they have the exact intelligence as the person who created them. Now, here's where you can see how people get really in trouble. For example, Howard Hughes was a brilliant man with a very strong mind. He was doing all kinds of great things in the world. Then he comes to discover about germs in the late 60s. His strong mind became so overly focused on them at this time and got overly concerned. To some degree, we all have these kinds of concerned thoughts, fears, and worries. But in some people, the over-energizing of them turns into obsession. Hughes really started worrying about these germs at the end of his life, and he put string around different areas of the home that he imagined were germ-free zones, and he stayed inside of these safe zones. Well, he ended up isolating himself from people in the world and dying as a recluse. Another one, Nikola Tesla, was one of the greatest scientists to ever come to the earth. He was the first to teach and demonstrate zero-point energy, and he gave the world alternating electric current. And a similar affliction happened to him, as did to Hughes. In the late 40s, he started overthinking and obsessing about germs and became a germaphobe. At this time, he was staying at the best hotel in New York City, the famous Plaza Hotel. It had one of the best restaurants to eat in. Nonetheless, Tesla would come to this very clean and fancy restaurant, bringing his own utensils and a clean cloth to wipe the glasses and plates to get rid of germs. He was just obsessed with it. So he too ends up dying a recluse in a little apartment in New York. He was afraid to go out because of germs. So he created a huge psychological shell around himself. And because his mind was so strong, this hell he created with his fears became an OCD. It became something that crippled him. We are all doing similar things to a lesser degree to ourselves. We each have something like that we try to avoid or indulge in. Maybe not to that extreme, of course, but people have strong habits and they have a hard time stopping them. Obviously, we don't want these things to control us. So what to do? What can be done when you have an unwanted elemental-driven behavior that you cannot stop? Call them undesirable neurosis, which is a relatively mild version of a mental or emotional illness. But all of them are being driven by elementals. Detrimental habits are quickly labeled by science as different kinds of neurosis. Now, we must be very careful about the drug dealers in this regard. And I don't mean Julio down by the schoolyard. I mean big pharmaceutical companies like Lilly, Pfizer, and the other usual suspects. They want to make drugs for every emotional and mental problem that only treats the symptom but never cures the illness. Because this is more profitable than curing the illness, but mostly it's because they don't really know what's driving these emotional and mental illnesses. Very few people know what's driving these kinds of illnesses. As we said, 80% of the elementals existing are the emotional thought type. They have a lot more emotion than real thought. These kinds can range in quality from what we might call evil, which means they're destructive, to mute and meaningless, as Christ called them. Thankfully, these are not as powerful and can be more easily disenergized. The other 20% are the thought-emotion type elementals. These are more powerful and tend to be fulfilled much faster because they are constructed with concentrated willpower using the inner noetical light. We create them with a lot of thought and not passionate desires. These kinds of elementals are much higher grade and are classified according to their purity. Thought emotion elementals are the kind that we should really be creating consciously now, and later we'll learn to create them superconsciously. It is both classes of elementals, the emotional thought ones and the thought emotional ones, that are composing our personality. This means it is the purity and nature of the elementals we harbor and express that is determining the purity and nature of our own personality. Recapping the lesson, I'm going to just go back because I didn't realize. I'm going to go back. I'm going to pick it up after higher grade classified according to their purity. Thought emotional elementals are the kind that we should be creating consciously now, and later we'll create them superconsciously. But it's both classes of elementals, the emotional thought ones and the thought emotional ones, that are composing our personality. Now, this means it is the purity and nature of the elementals we harbor and express that is determining the purity and nature of our own personality. Recapping the lesson, we have seen how our egotism's creation of unclean emotional desire type elementals, and by only looking outward using our 5 material senses, are the main things that lead us astray and cause us to get lost in the heavens. The highest human intelligence can only comprehend 7 heavens. And I tell you, Earth is the first heaven. In the next lesson, we'll speak about the purpose of our human incarnations. We will see how these beautiful but sometimes painful journeys are giving us so much more benefit than we can possibly realize at this point of our spiritual unfoldment. It's so much so that when we return back to our source and point of origin of our journey, we return in a more privileged condition than our archangelic brothers who have never journeyed out into incarnation. Hope you can join us next time. Thanks for listening.